Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Andy Churley. I'm Head of Marketing at BrandShelter. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar presentation today, all about SSLs and how the changes in the regulations of SSLs are affecting both internet users and the companies that employ them. I'll be kicking off very shortly. The webinar should take about 45 minutes, and we should have some time at the end for questions. And if you do have some questions, please type them into your chat window, and I will gather them up, and one of our presenters will respond to them at the end of the presentation. After the presentation, we will be sending a link to all participants so you can review the presentation or forward it on to your colleagues. If we have questions, then, like I say, we'll respond to them at the end. But at the same time, we'd like to ask you, the audience, a few questions, which will be coming up in the form of a poll on your browsers. So when we pose the question, you will have the option to say yes, no, or don't know. And that way we can gather some information about how SSLs are being used within your businesses. Which we'll share with you directly as the polls come in. Let me introduce you first of all to Stuart Fuller. Stuart is the head of BrandShelter. It's one of the most respected names in the domain industry and has been managing corporate domain names for many years. Stuart specialises in issues affecting brands online, and he's frequently published in a wide variety of internet-related publications, providing guidance on threats facing brands online, and has appeared quite often on television and other media discussing domain names and brand-related issues. And I'd like to introduce you also to Nick France, who is the CTO of SSL for Sectigo. Sectigo is a leading provider of digital identity solutions, including SSL and TLS certificates. And it's one of the world's largest certificate authorities with over 700,000 customers and has been operating for over 20 years. Nick is responsible for the technology and the practices necessary to operate Sectigo's global certificate authority and related services. And Nick previously served for more than 15 years as Sectigo's technical security officer. Without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Stuart, who will be leading with this presentation. I will switch myself off and leave the baton to Stuart.
So while we're waiting, let me kick off and just explain what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So we're going to talk about the SSL and TLS world today. You know, what's happening out there? Why is this such a hot topic to be discussing? Why use SSL and TLS at all? And how has the world evolved? And really, this is where Nick's expertise is going to come in, and where we're going to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing today. Then we're going to look at some of the features and considerations in managing an SSL portfolio. I think it's quite common for us to talk about domain name portfolios and managing domain name portfolios, but SSL is a little bit different, and often SSLs are ignored in terms of how they are managed. So we're gonna cover that, and finally we're gonna tie everything back in together and look at some of the ways in which BrandShelter can help you in both understanding your current SSL portfolio, but also understanding best practice and how potentially you could move forward and really understand the value you can get from SSL. And as Andy said, along the way, we're going to ask a few questions. We're going to get your opinions on things. But it's really a session where you can feel free to answer or ask any questions. And Nick, with his decades of experience in this market, will be able to answer them. And if not, we will take them away and obviously come back to you on anything that is not clear. There we go. Thank you, Andy. Let's move along and talk about what we're going to cover.
How's that?
Yeah, so it may be that you have to flick the slides over when we say, I think. There we go. Okay, right. So let's get going. So what we call the Foreplay protection for critical assets. What we really are talking about here is there are different aspects that you need to consider when we're talking about the threats that are out there in the digital environment. And these are the building blocks which we see a lot of ambitious and security-focused organizations really now starting to understand and put processes and procedures in place. Domain locking is the de facto best tool that an organization can use to protect its domain names from any type of abuse. Combine that with domain blocking. So what we covered those areas in our webinar back in August. Today we're going to talk about SSL and TLS, and the fourth element is really around enterprise DNS, and we're going to be covering enterprise DNS in our next webinar in November. But really, what we want to talk about is the fact today is about SSL and the SSL world today. If you operate a website or a blog in 2020, you have to have an SSL. It's now essential. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a must. And the reason why it's a must is because it protects not only your organization, but it protects your clients as well. And that's the really important thing. But before really we get into the nuts and bolts, I think we wanted to just clarify a few terms, because there is some confusion sometimes around some of the terms and some of the acronyms that are used here. SSL refers to Secure Sockets Layer. And this was originally developed by Netscape. So for those of you who are young enough, Netscape was one of the first internet browsers. And it was a protocol to transmit sensitive data between a user and a website across the internet. TLS refers to the transport layer. There is a model for those who are a little bit more techie than myself, called the TCP IP model. And depending on which flavor of that you look at, it can be either a 4-tier, a 5-tier, or a 7-tier model. And one of the tiers within that model is called the transport protocol layer. And what that does is define how the internet, which is the IP in this instance rather than intellectual property, works. So it defines that cryptographic protocol that authenticates data between users. And then we have HTTP, Hypertext Transport Protocol. This was the basis of web browsers and how they were originally created by Tim Berners-Lee. However, it is a non-secure data transfer protocol. When you see it with an S after it, that means that it is a secure variant of the protocol. So when you're using HTTP websites, data is being sent between the user and the website unencrypted. Technically, it's like you shouting across the road to a neighbor and someone standing in the middle of the road is able to hear everything you're saying. HTTPS encrypts that data and verifies the authenticity of the request. And one of the interesting definitions I saw online that I really like is this. It's like a food standards rating in a restaurant. Certainly here in the UK, it's not legal yet, but it's seen as best practice for a restaurant to display a number of stars they have for their food rating. And the idea behind it is that it ensures that a customer can feel safe and secure going into a food establishment, that they have followed the right protocols. So if it's a 5-star mark, customers will have the confidence that that is an organization that maintains the highest levels. But if they only have a 1 or 2 star, there could be some danger. There could be some issues. You could face some poorly maintained and exposed to hygiene risks. That's in a way to say the difference between HTTP and HTTPS. It is that 5-star to 1-star in terms of the risks that it is addressing. And then we have paid versus free SSL. There's been a lot of noise in the market about certain organizations that are able to offer free SSL. Why should I pay for something when I can get it for nothing? It's a really, really good point. But one of the maxims I use, and certainly my team here at BrandShelter often hear me say, and I'm sure they get a little fed up about it, is that price is only an issue in the absence of value. And free SSLs do not give the same level of value, the same level of trust, and the same level of confidence out to a consumer. These free SSLs don't provide that same level of authentication. And one of the main reasons is because those free SSLs are normally only available for 90 days, which means an organization has to keep validating them over a period of time. So therefore, it becomes quite onus on an organization to can constantly be on top of when those expiry dates are, and constantly be on top of maintaining their SSL protection. Free SSLs tend to come quite in a basic form. So if you're looking at any value adds, or you're looking at certificates that go over and above the type of security you need, then it's unlikely you're going to get those from a free SSL or a TLS. And finally, they can only ever be created for a single domain name. So if you're looking for solutions that include wildcard or SAN solutions, then you really need to be looking at a paid solution. We also saw there was a case during the summer of for one of the free SSL providers that they had an issue with some of their own certificates. So that's not to say that we don't see issues in the wider context, but it was a significant issue that impacted quite a lot of organizations. So let's really now look at why you should use an SSL or a TLS. And I think the main reason here is because you care. As an organization, you care about your customers, you care about your reputation, and you care about your revenues. And one of the things we're seeing is security, domain security is now the top story and the top headache for most organizations. Cybercrime is the greatest threat to every company in the world. I wish that was my saying that was being quoted. It's from Arvind Krishna, who is the CEO and chairman of IBM. And we're seeing this on a daily basis. Reported attacks are increasing. An average now of 30,000 websites get compromised every single day. So organizations have a duty of care, not only to themselves, but also to their customers, to be security conscious and security aware. So where some of the issues lay is around the transfer of information between a client, a customer, and the systems. Putting the SSL in there as part of a domain security solution, so using things like multi-factor authentication, using registry locks, having a monitoring solution, having a secure and stable DNS platform, all reduce those risks and all increase the trust and the reputation of the organization. Every organization needs to be part of a solution and not the problem. So it's not just enough for an organization to sit back and say, well, actually, this is the responsibility of my domain name registrar, or this is the responsibility of my DNS provider. Everyone has to take some accountability in this. And we've already seen some of the threats and some of the issues that are really coming to the fore in the wider society. And the story on the right was from the BBC 3 weeks ago that looks at the increasing cyber threats at disrupting the start of the university term. We can almost be guaranteed that with the US election, and that's starting to really ramp up over the next few weeks, the threat of cyber and domain security will be huge. And therefore, SSL plays its real part because of the encryption of data flow from a user to an organization is really, really important. In a recent Gallup poll, 71% of people surveyed said that the hacking of their personal data actually ranked higher than them being personally attacked. And consumer trust plays a massive part in this. And we know from our own experience, and we know from our customers' experience, that online shoppers now have become much more security conscious. And 85% in a recent survey that we looked at said that they would avoid unsecure websites. So if they were starting to get warnings that the information that they were trying to access wasn't safe or wasn't encrypted, then they would just abandon that user journey. And it's a common question. Would you buy from a website that was displaying a warning sign saying this website may not be secure? I think that most of us would actually say no. People value their personal information more than ever, and they only want to make sure it's disclosed on their terms. And this is where encryption is so important. And therefore, we have to ensure that there is trust in the website and that they are transacting with who they think they are. With an SSL in place or a TLS in place, it will mean that there's a safer, more trusted, authenticated user experience for your customer. That will improve conversion rates. People will not be abandoning their visit if they see warning signs. It ensures that the data is protected and sensitive. In a world where we now live under the requirements of GDPR, amongst other things, the loss of customer and sensitive data, it can be quite punitive on organizations. So therefore, you need to be taking steps to ensure that you are protecting the customers that are coming through. It also protects against phishing and man-in-the-middle attacks. But what's really interesting here is that due to the way that a number of organizations have their domain set up and have domain forwarding set up, some websites can fall between the gaps. And we found some examples where there are some very big brands who appear to not have the whole of their web forwarding and their web presence set up in a secure way. I'm sure you agree, you know, Disney, for example, so the Shop Disney site, go.com, is displaying a not secure message for certain web forwardings. One of the biggest mobile providers in the UK, Lush, is a global cosmetics company. Baidu is one of the biggest search engines in China. Apache, as in the software company, and MIT, the highly respected technology organization based in Boston, Massachusetts. These are all examples where we found where certain web forwardings are resulting in ending up on non-secure or not secure web pages. The second thing that obviously that is a real impact here is search rankings. We know that SSL is now seen as one of the factors that looks at search rankings, and we can see that a lot of organizations are actually understand that, and they're looking at their websites and how they appear in search. 58% of the top 1 million websites, Andy assures me this is correct, as he spent the last 4 weeks looking at every single one, uses SSL. And over 50% of sites on the first page of Google for a number of random searches we looked at, use SSL. And Google has always maintained that security is one of its pillars of search, and therefore it's a top priority. Google themselves have used their HTTPS Everywhere initiative that gives organizations a ranking advantage. And when you think about how competitive SEO can be, to spend a reasonably small amount of money on a certificate, let's say $100 on a certificate, to get that impact and that edge, the return on investment is huge. If we look at search, this fantastic table here, this is produced by some SEO experts called Search Engine Land. And they have produced this periodic table since 2011. And essentially what they're doing is they're saying, right, okay, these are the factors that impact search and SEO for an organization. And the idea being is it's looked at in terms of positive factors and negative factors, and also what changes every year. Now, the interesting way that they've formulated it in 2019 was in honor of the 150th anniversary of the creation of the periodic table. But what you can see is one really clear thing here, and that is now that HTTPS is seen as a ranking factor in SEO, and that changed in 2018. So now, when organizations are looking at their website and they're looking at what really impacts on SEO, you can now quite clearly see HTTPS is really one of those factors. They have produced, the organization behind this have produced a full SEO guide that goes into every single one of these factors. If anybody is interested in that, we can provide the link to that so you can download it yourself. So SSL also reduces data loss. And again, this is quite an important area because it encrypts the data. So therefore, it ensures that there is that man in the middle is not sitting there. So nobody is really able very easily to be able to divert data and take advantage of that. And by the fact of an organization using an SSL, it also means that you reduce phishing and you reduce the dangers there. We know that the internet is not secure. We know that it's almost impossible due to the nature of the fact that nobody owns the internet. It is a wide, vast series of networks that are pulled together, and therefore it's very difficult to have one security protocol that governs everything. But SSL can ensure that you validate the entities who you're communicating, and that reduces the opportunity both for data loss and also for phishing. And finally, when we start looking at the future, and we look at the 100% secure web, we know that browser vendors are pushing towards having as many of their domains that are issued and as many of live websites using HTTPS and encryption certificates. We know that browsers will show negative security indicators for sites without certificates, and we know that new browsers features will require HTTPS, as well as geolocation, as well as accessibility, as well as camera access. We also know that the browser market is changing, and they're starting to dictate some of the terms, which I think is a really good time to hand over to Nick to tell us what's going on really with the SSL and TLS market.
Yep, thanks very much, Stuart, and thanks everybody. So yeah, all the great points we've talked about so far. But one of the things that I wanted to talk to everybody about was there have been a lot of changes in our business over the past few years. I think, as Stuart just suggested, we are more in a position now where the CAs, such as the Sectigo, who I work for, which is a certificate authority that creates these certificates, we are kind of more having to bend to the will of the browser vendors and the OS vendors. So the likes of Google, Microsoft, Apple, Mozilla, and Oracle. And that's because they obviously represent all of the users, and they represent the browsers and the general users of the internet. So there's been a number of changes over the past few years, but one that's very, very recent and is quite significantly impacting is this reduction in the lifetime of certificates. So back when I started working in this industry, back when it was Komodo many years ago, we could offer certificates that worked in your browser for up to about 10 years. And that was great. We sold someone a 10-year product. The problem, of course, is if there was anything wrong with that certificate, so the customer had made a mistake, or perhaps it was using some kind of technical aspect, an encryption algorithm that is weak, or some information in it was wrong, then we potentially had to wait 10 years for that certificate to expire before we could remedy the problem. So we've had a reduction in certificate lifetime over the past few years, but as of September this year, we are now at a maximum of 1 year for certificates. So it's just over 1 year technically, it's 398 days. What actually happened was Google proposed a ballot in a group called the CA and Browser Forum, which is like a self-regulating industry body of CAs and browsers and other interested parties. But they proposed a ballot last year to reduce the maximum lifetime down from 2 years down to 1. The ballot failed. There wasn't enough support for it on kind of both sides of the aisle. But then we kind of expected that they were going to make a change at some point. And what I mean by that is Google could enforce it in their own software. They could say, okay, Google Chrome and Android are not going to accept longer than 1 year certificates anymore. As it happened, they didn't do that first, but in February of this year, before all the pandemic set in, there was a CA browser forum meeting in Slovakia. And at that meeting, Apple basically announced that they were going to enforce this change down to 398 days. Now, just because Apple required that change doesn't mean that we could kind of ignore it and perhaps sell you a certificate that didn't work with Apple. This was a requirement for us to function on all Apple devices. So it really meant that they were setting the bar for us, which would impact everybody else. So they said, as of the 1st of September, all certificates that you issue have to be a maximum of 1 year. Well, it's 398 days, so it's the longest possible year, it's a leap year. It's the longest possible month, which is 31 days, and then plus 1 day on top of that, just to kind of account for any rounding errors, really. So 398 days is the maximum. And that came into enforce on September the 1st. Mozilla and Google sort of followed that decision a bit later in the year, but effectively the date is still has been September the 1st this year. And this is important to note that it only affects the kind of certificates that we've been talking about, everything that Stuart's talked about. This is what we call server certificates, so geared specifically towards websites. There are a bunch of other types of certificate that are created and that we offer. So things like email certificates for signing your email, or code signing certificates for signing Windows applications. And then there's also something called internal certificates, which many organizations use to kind of secure other things beyond their websites, to say secure VPN access or Wi-Fi access. None of those are affected here. It's purely the certificates for the websites. And as we can see on the next slide, it's just a little overview that both Mozilla and Google and Microsoft and everybody have kind of agreed to this standard. And it is down to 398 days, as I say, 1 year, 1 month, and 1 day. And you can see, obviously, Chrome with a sizable market share here, they can drive these changes. They can say, we are going to do this, and effectively everybody else ourselves and the rest of this, but with that, they are the dominant browser. But equally, because especially when Apple did this, they said it's a requirement to be included in our program. It meant that the bar was set that way for everybody. Now, there are obviously challenges in this reduction in lifetime that we've certainly seen with a lot of our customers, and certainly your customers will see it as well, and yourselves, you will see it, because an action that you were previously taking every, let's say, 3 years or previously 2 years, you now have to do every year. And with all the points that Stuart's previously talked about, how SSL adoption is being driven up, these browsers, particularly Chrome, are trying to get to 100% secure web and a fully secure internet. The number of certificates you have to manage is massively increasing. So it's no longer just having one certificate for your credit card payment page, as it was back when I started in this industry. It's now every single website that you have. And that could be your payment page, that could be your main home page, or your login. It could be a form to fill out for a webinar like this, where you're entering personal data. But it can also just be things as simple as a brochure site, as a marketing page. All of those have to have a certificate on, because otherwise they're going to see those nasty warning messages that the browsers are putting in place, and your customers are going to be potentially dissuaded from doing business with you. But that does mean that you have a sizable management task, therefore, with all of these different certificates you have to deal with. And of course, many of them may have different expiry dates. They're not all going to expire at the same time. Perhaps you don't want them to, even if it was an option. So really, what you need to look at, and I think as we're going to get into in the next section, is now that there are more certificates for you to manage, now that the replacement of these certificates is becoming a burden that happens more frequently, how are we going to manage these certificate portfolios that we all have that are simply growing in size and growing in complexity? Sorry, this slide briefly here with a bit of an overview of the 398 days, just to very quickly explain kind of one of the questions that has come up a lot, I will say, is the question of why. Why would you move down to 1 year? Why? Because this is obviously a burden. As I say, this is something that is going to impact everybody. And I think the main reason, that one I mentioned before about how long certificates are out there that could potentially have problems. Obviously, once a certificate's issued, it can be very difficult to get customers and to get the end user of these certificates to change them. But obviously they have to when it expires. And reducing the lifetime really means that we can change through these certificates much more rapidly. So it's for when there are bad things about the certificate, and bad is a general term, but a couple of good examples are, over the past few years, we've had to make some changes to what we call the encryption keys that we use in certificates. As Stuart's talked about, it provides encryption and security of data, but obviously there's huge advances going on in the world in computing and mathematics, and it means that the codes we use today might not be strong in the future. There's something that you may have seen in even in the standard press, something called quantum computing, to do with quantum physics, and it potentially means that all the codes we use today can be broken very, very quickly. So we need the ability to adopt stronger, better systems and more advanced systems. And the best way to do that is to reduce the certificate lifetime so that people get more used to replacing these things more frequently. And it allows us to adopt newer and better standards much more quickly. We don't have to wait 10 years for something to expire before we can change to the new standard. And it means that we can encourage the adoption of better management and better automation, which is what we're going to talk about next. Because when you have so many certificates to deal with and you have to change them with such frequency, then looking at management and automation are really the best things that you need to do to get a handle on your certificate portfolio.
Thanks, Nick. Interestingly, so we ran a poll during the last section where we asked, do you use certificates of less than 1 year in duration? And 50% of people said they do. So it's interesting that we're already seeing a trend of a shorter certificate periods.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would, there's a potential attribution of that to one of the points you mentioned earlier, Stu, which is, there are these free CAs out there that are offering these shorter lifetime certificates. And as you mentioned, they are, they are technically the same certificate that we already have, but obviously the problem with them being 9 days is you're having to deal with them more frequently, you're having to manage them more frequently, and of course some of the problems that I don't think were touched upon to do with the free CAs is you don't have that support, you don't have a management tool, you don't have the support of an organization that can help you, you don't have SLAs or anything like that. So while it's great that people are adopting these shorter certificate lifetimes, it's going to be very interesting to see how they are managing all of these certificates that are having to be replaced every 3 months.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we now look at the management of an SSL portfolio, I think that most organizations would agree it's something that takes time. There was a very interesting report published last year with an interesting title of the impact of unsecured digital identification. And in that report, it said that the organizations that had been surveyed, about 73% said they saw unexpected outages due to certificates not being installed correctly or expiring without anybody knowing about them. And I think that's a really, really interesting position, because we know that there are different types of SSLs. So we know that organizations will have more than one domain name. That's just the nature. Many have tens of thousands. And likewise, they'll have more than one certificate. And an example, 2 weeks ago, I was doing a portfolio analysis for a power company. They had just over 500 domain names, and they had 40 SSL certificates as well. They came from 5 different vendors. They were a mix of domain validated, extended validated, organization validated, and wildcard. They had some that had expired that they weren't aware of, and they had some that were going to expire that they didn't know when they expired. So what's really interesting is that we're seeing already that organizations, whilst they may have a handle on their domain name portfolios and they've got a policy in place or a documented procedure, SSLs is less likely. And there's a number of reasons for that. They're complicated. They're not necessarily something that is understood by all the people in an organization. And each certificate that is used has a slightly less or a different function. They expire. With domain names, there's grace periods, there's redemption periods. So the day in which a domain name expires isn't necessarily the end of the road for that domain name. With SSLs, they expire and they stop working. And there is a very good reason for that. It's about security. It's about authentication. It's about trust. So moving to that 1 year maximum or the 13-month maximum period, it means that organizations will have to be really on top of how they managed their SSLs. Because SSLs, they're used against a website and a web visitor. So whilst some domain names may not have any intrinsic value to an organization, they may be there just for defensive purposes. SSLs aren't. And if an SSL expires or is not installed properly, it will have an immediate business impact. So it's something that needs to be really kept on top of. What we found, certainly in our dealing with organizations over the last 5 or 6 years, is most companies don't really know how many SSLs they have. They know they have a number of different ones, but they don't really keep them centrally managed. And therefore, that can lead to problems when it comes to renewing the certificate, understanding who needs to do what, and understanding the right level of a certificate they need. Interestingly, many organizations wouldn't have a separate SSL budget. It may be included in their IT, in their security, or in their domain budget, but they don't tend to have a specific budget for SSL. And that is why the outsourcing and management of SSLs to specialist companies is quite key. And interestingly, again, in our latest poll, we have about 60% of people who have responded said that they do use a management tool or service for SSL certificates, which is really good because that will ensure that simple things like expiries or the installation of certificates isn't missed. But what happens if you don't have that management tool? Well, one of the great things that we're able to provide here at BrandShelter is we're able to provide an SSL or a TLS audit. We have our own proprietary auditing system that looks at domain portfolios, and one aspect of that is around the domain name security. So it looks at domain locking, it looks at DNS and how the DNS is being used, but it also looks at SSL. So what we're able to do is we're able to create that audit and look at the certificates that are associated with the domains in the portfolio, what type of certificate, when it expires, and who they were issued by. And a lot of the features that we are building within BrandShelter will allow that also to get a view on third-party certificates. So even if the domain names themselves may not be with BrandShelter, you're able to upload and list details of the SSLs so that you can renew them very quickly, and there's going to be no danger of the SSLs ever being dropped. And one of the areas, again, that we're looking at in 2021 is the ability for certain certificates to auto-renew, where we're able to pre-validate information. Then we're looking at how we can actually have a continuous process for the SSL. So in summary, SSL, we know it is one of a number of security measures, but it is probably the most visible, effective, and easy one to implement because it allows and it encrypts that information between the user and the organization. And each organization, each brand holder has a responsibility for their revenue, for their customers and their reputation. And that's where we find that the SSL is that recognized protocol for ensuring that safe communication between the two organizations. We know that HTTPS is now that de facto standard of encryption. And we know that certificate issuance is now brought down to the 13 months max for the web certificates, as Nick explained. But it is really important to understand the portfolio and really important to have a policy in place. You can measure and you can understand exactly what is happening with your SSL portfolio. BrandShelter is able to provide that for you, and if you contact us after this webinar, then we'll be able to assist and give you some advice. So with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending this afternoon. I'd like to thank Nick for attending. I'd like to thank Sectigo, who are a fantastic partner for us. And if there are any questions, we can open up the floor in the next couple of minutes. Just a reminder that our next webinar in the series is going to be on DNS and what DNS really means for your organization, which is going to be led by Andy. And hopefully we're going to have a couple of guests on that as well too. So with that, Andy, I'll pass it back to you to see if there's any questions that we can answer.
So Stu, the question that came in was, we heard you talking about DV, OV and EV certificates. Can you explain what the difference is between them, please?
Yeah, sure. And I'll also invite Nick to jump in on this as well. So these are just the three different levels of type of certificates that are issued, and each one has a different level of authentication required. So DV is domain validated. It's probably the simplest certificate that an organization can have. And in terms of validation, in order to apply for the certificate, It's just ensuring that the domain details are consistent with who is applying for the certificate and the domain it's going to be used against. Organization validated looks a little bit deeper. It looks at the organization that's applying for the certificate, and there's a number of checks will be done to ensure that that is the right organization, to ensure that the person applying for the certificate is the right person and is able to apply for the certificate. And then extended validation, as it suggests, it goes into much more detail, and various different calls will be made depending on who the certificate authority is to the organization to just ensure that they are who they say they are, because that's the certificate that gives the highest level of trust.
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly right, Stuart. Yeah, the difference is really in that the additional level of information or the amount of information that's put into each certificate. All three of the different types do have the domain names verified. So we are, as a CA, we're required to verify that when someone comes to us and say, I want a certificate for Amazon.com, we obviously have to verify that they own Amazon.com or they control Amazon.com. So we wouldn't just give it to someone that could then go and use it for malicious purposes. So we do that for all the certificates. And then those the two, the OV and the EV types you mentioned, you're exactly right. They include additional business information, and the differences between the two is really in how thorough the checks are on that information. OV tends to be a basic check. You know, in the UK, is the company registered with Companies House? Are they, you know, an active, valid company? When it gets to the EV level, we check they're a company in good standing. We verify the people who sign a subscriber agreement for that certificate. So we would need to verify you, as an example, if you'd requested that certificate. So it's really to do with the different amount of information we put in the certificate, how much we verify that, and as a result, as you suggested, that reflects the kind of authentication and the reassurance to your end customers as to essentially, you know, your representation within that certificate.
So I think it's fair to say then that the certificate at its broadest level has kind of two levels of function, one of which is to keep communications between those two parties secure, and that's the encryption part of that certificate. And the second is to provide a guaranteed level of trust that the entity with which you're talking or communicating is who they say they are.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It's all about encryption and identification or authentication, because encryption is you know, the mathematical act of taking some data and encoding it so only the other person that you're sending it to can read that data. But of course, doing the strongest encryption in the world is kind of pointless if you don't actually know who you are sending it to at the other end. So it really has to combine those two things in order to make the whole concept of security and internet security work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And then, funnily enough, on a similar vein, the next question that's come in, which I'll throw over straight to Nick, I think, is what's the difference between a wildcard certificate and a SAN certificate? And
it's a good question. It's a good question. So we've talked about the three validation levels of certificate: DV, OV, and EV. There is another type of certificate that we'll talk about here, and I'll explain what types of what validation level of certificate you can get. But certificate themselves generally come in three flavors beyond DV, OV, and EV. So there's a single certificate, which is usually just issued to a single fully qualified domain name. So, you know, www.nickfrance.com or nickfrance.com. So it's just issued to one name. Then a wildcard is issued to something like star.domain.com. And that star, that asterisk character, can represent any number of subdomains. It's a bit like, you know, wildcarding functions in DNS. So it allows that one certificate to cover all of your different subdomains, www.secure.mail.shop. Anything like that. And it basically is it's almost a financial benefit, because a single certificate can cover all of those different subdomains, and you don't have to have a separate certificate for each, and of course a separate one to manage. There are good reasons to use wildcard certificates, and there are also some reasons not to use them. It very much depends on, you know, your hosting and your infrastructure that you're using it on. The other certificate type is sometimes called a SAN certificate. SAN stands for Subject Alternative Name, which is kind of the technical area within a certificate where the domain names are placed, really. And it's also got other names, sometimes called a multi-domain certificate, or sometimes called a unified communication certificate. And all they really are is it is one certificate that allows you to have many different domain names in, and it's a comparatively new product, but it's kind of the most popular. And the reason is, honestly, nowadays people don't just have one domain name anymore. You know, I don't, you know, we don't just own Sectigo.com. We have, you know, Sectigo.uk, .net, .org, all the different CCTLDs and some of the new GTLDs that are available. And if a lot of those sites point to the same, domains point to the same site, you can have all of those domains within a single certificate. Again, instead of having to manage a lot of different certificates or a lot of separate certificates together, you can combine them into one. And there are some other technical reasons why they have benefits as well, but they're basically the three types. And you can have a DV multi-domain certificate or an OV wildcard certificate. You can cross over all the different types. There's only one exception, and that is you cannot have wildcard EV certificates. It's one of the things that's disallowed in the EV standard, the EV guidelines.
Thanks, Nick. That's in fact, you answered my second question there, which was, can you have different types of certificates as wildcard and SAN? So that's excellent. I think unfortunately we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. We have shared in the chat a white paper called The Business Manager's Guide to SSL Certificates, which is there if you want to click on that and download it. This explains everything that we've talked about in the presentation today. And if you wish to contact us to get more information, please feel free to do so. We will be sharing the link to the replay of this webinar in the next couple of hours, and that will come straight through to your email address. If you want to share that with your colleagues, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much for your attendance. Apologies for the slight technical difficulties at the beginning. I hope you found this seminar as interesting as I have, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next one. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, gents. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.